Good morning and welcome to the William P. Faust Public Library of Westland. For this, the final stop of the Michigan Humanity Council's Great Michigan Read Author Tour, featuring Steve Luxenberg, author of this year's Great Michigan Read selection, Annie's Ghost, A Journey into a Family Secret. We are pleased to see all of you here today, and also those of you who are able to join us on Google Hangout. When we saw the great response for this event, we did our best to accommodate everyone. When it comes time for the question and answer portion, we ask that anyone with a question please come to the meeting rooms A and B if you're not already here, as we will not be able to answer questions online. We hope to have Steve answer as many questions as possible, but know that he may not get to all of them. One other program note, Joe Johnson of the Westland Historical Society and the impetus behind the Friends of Eloise and the Eloise Museum was not able to attend and moderate today's program, so we have Steve all to ourselves. I would also like to remind everyone that we have 3 more Great Michigan Read programs coming up, including an afternoon book club featuring Annie's Ghost, a program on researching the passenger ship lists with Chris Rapinski from the Library of Michigan, and a rescheduled visit to the K. Beard building to hear Joe Johnson and Marilyn McKee talk about the history of Eloise. We have flyers on the table outside for more information about these events, or also you can go to our website, www.westlandlibrary.org. Before Steve's presentation, I would like to introduce Eric Nordberg, Executive Director of the Michigan Humanities Council, to talk about the wonderful community building program that is the Great Michigan Read. Let's give him a round of applause.
Well, it's great to see all of you here today. I don't want to take up a lot of your time because you didn't come to hear me, did you? No. But just wanted to thank the Westland Library for partnering with us on this event. The Great Michigan Read is one of several programs that we run at the Michigan Humanities Council. Although we're based in Lansing, we're a statewide nonprofit that does various types of cultural programming right around the state. The Great Michigan Read is our signature program. Our idea is to get everybody in the state, or at least as many as we can snag, to all read the same book over the course of a year, to have conversations about the themes in that book, and to come together as a community to talk about things that are important to us as residents of Michigan. We look for Michigan authors, we look for books that are about Michigan, that have themes that are relevant to people here in our state. We want people to read. That's definitely part of the program. And how many of you read the book? Great. It's always good to see hands here. And that's Steve always asks me to do that, so he knows how many of you are familiar with the book. But it's also about events like this, where people come together to talk about the book. You're going to ask Steve questions, but he's going to ask you questions as well. So I think you're going to find that it's really much about how we think about these. It's been a wonderful book for us. It has a lot of interesting themes. I think the series of events that the Westland Library set up illustrate that. Everything from genealogy to the history of mental health in Michigan at Eloise, to even topics about why people make secrets and how they keep them. So we've been right all over the state with this program. We've taken Steve up to Sault Ste. Marie. He's been down to St. Joe. We have 300 partner organizations around the state, everywhere from Copper Harbor in the western UP right down to the Ohio border. So book clubs, libraries, other organizations are engaging, just as you are, in this great conversation about what it means to be in Michigan and how books can bring us together for these conversations. I would be lax if I didn't acknowledge some support that we have. You'll see in some of the literature lists of all of our sponsors, but always want to be sure that people are aware that we work closely with the National Endowment for the Humanities, a federal agency. So just when you think the federal government isn't doing things, they're helping to support programs like this. So don't forget them in the mix. We also get support from the Meyer Corporation to take this activity around the state. I want to specifically thank Andy and the Westland Library. Although it's really cool to be a statewide organization and do things right across the state, we don't do the programs. Our local partners do. you're here because Andy has run this event, and so I'm very thankful to him and to Westland for pulling this together. The other nice thing that I get to do is I get to introduce our speaker, our author, and I've gotten to know Steve just really over the last 6 months, and probably could tell you all sorts of things. Catch up with me later. Those of you that don't know, he's a television actor. He was in The Wire. That's a good start, right?
Absolutely.
Steve is a native of the Detroit area. Some of you may know a place called Henry Ford High School. He's a graduate of that August Academy. And he's a newspaper person by profession. Worked with the Washington Post, elevated himself to editor there, and has worked on several really interesting projects, 2 of which received Pulitzer Prizes. The book that you're here to talk about today was selected for the Michigan Notable Books program. If you're not familiar with that group that the Library of Michigan puts together each year, have a look for that. And this book, as I said, has been just a wonderful vehicle for us. So without further ado, I'm going to turn things over to Steve, and you can have at him.
Well, the first thing I want to do is give a big shout out to those people in the overflow. Let's give them a hand. Of course, we might ask why they weren't here earlier. Sorry, people. Early bird gets the worm, right? So Jo Johnson fled north. She went up to do a family, some sort of family thing. Why aren't you fleeing north? This beautiful weather, why did you come to hear me? I'm honored that you're here. I hope we'll have a good hour or so of great conversation. As I was driving here, I got off of I-275 from where I was staying, and I noticed that one of the attractions for the area is IKEA. So I know why you're here to see me. Shopping, Steve Luxenberg, no contest. Eric, thank you for calling Henry Ford an August Academy. I don't think it's ever been called that. So The Wire. I really wasn't an actor on The Wire. An actor requires that you speak lines. Would you like to see my performance on The Wire? I can reenact it for you.
Okay.
Think of a big crowd like this, standing in a newsroom, listening to the editor give bad news, and I'm in the background doing the following. I know many of you here have some connection to Eloise. How many of you would say that you have some connection? And you all benefit in some ways, if you're from the Westland area, by the economy, the engine of economy that Eloise performed for many years in this area, besides their main mission of taking care of people with a mental health issue. There also was the general hospital side of things, which made Eloise even a more important part of this community. Well, that was Wayne County General. No one would have called that part of it Eloise. And there are still some people today, when you say Eloise, that kind of scratch their head because they're too young to know that that's the nickname that the whole hospital complex involved. I'm going to do, since many of you have read the book, but some of you have not, and what's wrong with you? I'm going to meld a little bit of the story so that people who have not read the book catch up. Let's give them, let's not criticize them for not being there with us. And then I'm going to try to expand and tell you a little bit about what's happened since the book has been published, since I appeared at this very library in 2009, where I was lucky enough to be hosted in the early days before the book became so popular. I'm also going to talk a bit about the micro, which is the family, in this case my family, but it could be anybody's family. The macro, which is Eloise and the system that took in my aunt. And I want to talk about the larger mental health system beyond Eloise, because that too, even though Eloise was massive, it was part of something else. And then I'm going to talk for maybe about 20, 25 minutes, and then that will leave plenty of time for questions. And all the things I left out in my first 20 minutes, I will then put into the question and answer part of it. When we get to the question and answer part, don't feel you need to ask a question. I mean, be brief, because there are many people here who have questions. But you can share a comment. You can tell a story. You can tell me you met my aunt, and I'll ask you why I didn't meet you 5 years ago. That's happened to me several times. You've heard the term crowdsourcing, which is the idea that on the internet you put a piece of writing up and people comment. I probably should have put this book up on the internet for all of the people who now have told me they had something to contribute to my research, and I never met them before the book came out. So I want to talk about the family in this situation. That's my family, and this is the catch-up part for those who haven't read the book. I'm going to give you some dates. Dates always help because we think in a linear way. My mom is born in 1917. Annie is born in 1919. My mom is Beth. Annie is my aunt. My mom dies in 1999. She's 82 years old. Annie dies in 1972 when I'm 20, and Annie was 53. They were the children of two grandparents who came here from overseas, from what is now the place in turmoil, Ukraine. People now know what Ukraine is. They're from the western part, which would like to remain separate from Russia. But they were at that time, in the days when they were there, which was before World War I, they were living in what was then Russia. Annie was born with a deformed leg. I'm going to demonstrate for you. I hope the camera will follow me here. She had a leg that didn't ever straighten out. It was fitted with a crutch or a brace through the first 16 years of her life. It delayed her going to school. She went to school at the age of 8 and not at the age of 5. She went to a school named in that time for crippled children. She had trouble getting around in her crutch and brace, but she managed to do it, according to the people that I interviewed. But at the age of 16, after the leg had atrophied, and it really wasn't try walking around on one leg and a crutch or a brace, they amputated her leg, and they gave her a wooden leg, which was a benefit because it gave her a stable platform on which to walk, but it was also a challenge because you had to take care of a wooden leg. You couldn't we wear our legs around all the time, but wooden legs must be detached and cleaned, kept free of sweat. Not something easy for someone like Annie to do. Her mental health issue didn't manifest itself until later on, when she was about 18 or 19 years old. I think tell them it's a great talk, whoever's cell phone. Just text, selfies, it's all fine. Annie it didn't manifest itself until about 18 or 19. I think for the first 16 years of her life, it's safe to say that all of the attention was focused on the visible physical deformity that she had. Today, she would receive counseling, I think, for the psychological impacts of having that kind of experience, certainly counseling before she had an amputation. But in those days, she did not receive such counseling. I suspect that was part of what manifested itself in a mental health issue at the age of 19 or 20. In 1995, where do stories begin? And if you told a story in your family, but your brother or sister who was 10 or 12 years younger, as I am, were to tell the story, we probably would tell different stories. Stories do not begin at the beginning. They begin where we want them to begin, where some emotion begins. And for me, this story begins in 1995, when my mom, then 78 years old, driving herself to work as a bookkeeper for a small company down the Lodge Expressway from her apartment in Farmington Hills at 12 and Middlebelt to 8 Mile Road, on the Detroit side of 8 Mile Road. She's going to the hospital a lot because she has emphysema, her reward for smoking cigarettes for 60 years. And it's really her only health problem, but she's going there frequently enough that the hospital, which is the Botsford Hospital at 9 in Grand River, does something I think is pretty good for a hospital, which is that it recognizes the long-term arc of what's happening here, and it sends a psychiatrist to speak with her, not to treat her, not to give her medication, just to talk with her and find out whether anxiety is part of what's causing her to come in and part of her panic attacks or shortness of breath. And he decides, in talking to her, to do what all psychiatrists do. Well, tell me a little bit about yourself, Mrs. Luxenberg. Tell me about your background, your family. And she tells him, without any apparent inflection, that she had a sister who was 2 years old when she was institutionalized. My mom at the time was 4. and my mom has no idea what happened to her. Those are the flat facts that appear in his notes that I read 10 years later. She didn't tell him it was a secret. She didn't tell him that none of her children knew the facts that she had just imparted. When I was growing up, I knew 3 things about my mom. 1, her name was Beth. 2, she was an only child, because she told us many stories about being an only child. And 3, she always told me to tell the truth. Sorry, Bertha. You didn't tell the truth. And she wasn't an only child, even though when she first met the woman who was to become my wife, who is an only child, at least as far as I know. How many people here are only children? Send me an email, I'll investigate it for you. You know, in newsrooms, we say to stress accuracy, we say, if your mother loves you, check it out. I never knew I would actually know. She wasn't an only child, and her relationship with the truth was, like all of our relationships with the truth, rather complicated. How many people here have never told a lie? How many people here are proud of everything they've ever done? So you can see that as I approach this story, what I was trying to accomplish, a book that I call a book of understanding, not of judgment. I was trying to stand in my mom's shoes. I was trying as best as possible to do what I believe the first duty of a historian actually is, which is to see the world through the eyes of the people you're writing about, and not through our eyes 50 years later. It's very difficult to do. Right now I'm researching a book in which I live every morning in the 1850s. Well, I didn't live in the 1850s. I don't know what it's like to walk down the street, whether they had sidewalks or mud or gutters. I don't know what happened when it rained or when it didn't. I've never ridden a horse, which many people in the 1850s had to ride. But that's the duty of a historian. No different here. 1940 is not so far away from now, actually. Many of us in this room can either tell us that we've lived in 1940 or had a parent who lived in 1940, and it's a real time to them. But and yet it's not a real time, because I didn't live then. I was born in 1952. One of the things I did is that I took the titles of the magazines that I knew my mom had read, because we still got subscriptions to those when I was a young kid, and I went back to the 30s when she was a young woman, and I read the magazines that I hoped, I don't know, that she might have read, to try to find out how the world felt to her. One of those magazines had an article titled, "Is Everybody Schizophrenic?" Because at that time, the diagnosis for mental health was getting better. We were diagnosing more and more people with a mental illness. So many people that it would lead to an article in which you could ask whether everybody had one. That article also made very plain that if you had a mental illness, it was probably in your genes. Something that is not true. Sometimes it's true, sometimes not, but certainly not true today. Now, I'm not going to ask you to reveal anything about your own mental health, but the other night I'll tell you this little story. Someone said to me, "We have no mental health issues in my family, thank God." And I said, "Have you ever been to a therapist?" The person said, "Yeah." I said, "You have a mental health issue." The reason I say it that way is it's that simple. If we can make mental health into something that is an ordinary, common occurrence, it becomes less of a frightening thing. Now, the mental health system that I'm going to talk about a little bit went through a tremendous revolution just in the period of time that spans Annie's life. From 1940 to 1971, no one living in 71 could imagine that in 1940 things were very different. But then, like the same converse truth, people living in 1940 couldn't imagine that by 1980 there would be no Eloise. I don't say this, I don't make that fact up. That's what the superintendent of Eloise wrote in 1933. He wrote, "This institution will grow ever larger." By 1980, it was no more. Now, In 1940, I'm going to tell you what the standard was for someone to be treated for a mental health issue in a psychiatric institution. The standard was, the legal standard, you needed to give care and treatment to the state of Michigan's defectives. That was the law. Well, if you need to give care and treatment, if you owe them that, if you have an obligation, and you're not, in those days they were probably less afraid of lawsuits than we are today, but diagnosis is getting better, you owe people care and treatment, you're taking care of them, it's a paternal system or a maternal system. And that's why we had ever-growing larger asylums like Eloise. How many of you plan to see the movie that's being made about Eloise? Everybody know about the movie? Just announced, Hollywood. One of the stars of Gossip Girl is the male lead. The actress named Eliza Dushka is the female lead, and it's filming, I've heard it's filming even, they're starting to make preparations right now. I read the description, and it's, I'm sorry to say, the kind of description that you shake your head at when they make movies in Hollywood about mental health institutions. I'd like to get that Hollywood image of the sad, depressing, at best, the place of abuse at worst, out of our heads. Because that's not a real image of what happened in places like Eloise. Sure, there's no doubt there's a kernel of truth. We know that abuse went on sometimes in mental health places and in other places. We know that it was not a fun place to be. Many of you probably have had a chance to have visited Eloise during its heyday, and I'm certain that you wish that you didn't need treatment and weren't there. On the other hand, it's also wrong to say that there were cruel people who were running places like Eloise. They were doing the best they could at the time. Sometimes they were not doing the best they could, and we should fault them for that. They were doing the best they could, and they sent some of the best and the brightest from Wayne and Michigan, medical students who were in training, to both the general hospital and to the psychiatric institution. And they tried the most progressive techniques they had to treat people for what was still then a mystery and is still today a mystery, which is the mystery of the mind. So they tried lobotomy for 4 years and abandoned it because it just didn't work in their experience. I know this from Ed Savage, who was the director of the male psychiatric division and fortunately still alive and sitting in the back of the Detroit Public Library's Burton collection one day when I was there, and I jumped on him when someone told me, hey, you want to go talk to somebody who used to work at Eloise? Talk about a deer in the headlights. He had these really thick glasses. He looked up at me and said, when I handed him the records that I had, which was about 12 pages, he said, where's the rest of it? I said, if you can help me, I'll have it. Unfortunately, I didn't have too much success. But Miscavige was a great guide to what the Eloise was of the era that he worked in, but he was only one guy, because he saw it from the perspective of the psychiatrist who's treating people. I put a little notice into the retirement newsletter for Wayne County, which essentially said, not in these words, attention all former Eloise employees, please contact me, I'm writing about Eloise. I received a lot of email from that. 0. Nobody reads the retirement newsletter. I'm not faulting anybody. It's my job to find people. And I did find a lot of people, but I never found an employee who knew Annie. And there's something in that I think is metaphorical, which is that my mother, when she left the neighborhood where she grew up, she reinvented her identity. Annie lost her identity. She became essentially anonymous. Anonymous to the world, certainly, but even anonymous to the people who were working at Eloise. And she was quite visible as a person with a wooden leg, and yet I could not find anybody by using that fact who said, oh, I know Eloise, I know Annie. So I told you that in 1995 I learned these facts. My mom was 4, Annie was 2. After my mom died, we received a letter from the cemetery where our grandparents are buried. Now, this secret keeper, my mom, why she was having this annual solicitation asking if we wanted to have flowers planted for the spring on these graves, why she was having it sent to the house, is one of the great unexplained mysteries of the story. It seems like that's a threat if you're trying to keep a secret. My sister dismisses it by saying, your dad never opened the mail and we weren't allowed to. So I guess maybe it was safe. But after she died, the letter was forwarded to my brother in Boston. And when he opened it, he made a phone call to me and he said, who the heck is Annie? Because there were 3 graves listed and not 2. And I said, well, it must be that 2-year-old we heard about. But why is she buried at the same place as our grandparents if my mom has no idea what happened to her? Oh, Stephen, maybe you were gullible in 1995. Maybe your mom wasn't 4. Maybe Annie wasn't 2. Maybe you should have been more of a journalist and less of a son. And maybe you know the truth, which is that my mom was 23 and Annie was 21 when she was admitted to Eloise. They grew up in the neighborhood. My mom was not, by biological fact, an only child. Not even the excuse that I gave her, which is that if you lose your sister at the age of 4, well, you kind of are an only child. You lose the opportunity to enjoy that relationship, love-hate relationship probably for most of us, that you would have. So, Mom, you are an only child. Well, that excuse was gone. Now I was really curious. Now I really wanted to understand more about this, and the journalist in me kicked in. And I found out many of the facts that I put together for the book. Now, I didn't start writing the book in 2000 when that letter from the cemetery arrived. I started writing it in 2005 after an agent read something I wrote in the Washington Post and said, you know, you're a pretty good writer. You got any ideas for a book? And I said, well, I do, but you'll not be thinking it's the typical kind of story. And I sat with her for about a half an hour and essentially did a talk like this one. Not quite an elevator pitch, unless the elevator was about 140 stories tall. And at the end of the half an hour, she looked at her watch and she said, I got another half an hour. Let's keep talking. Now, when I told that story once in her presence at a talk much like this, she came up to me afterwards and said, I don't remember it that way. See, memory is already faulty. 2 people, 1 conversation, 2 memories. She said, I remember saying, you got a lot of work to do, pal. I do remember her saying that, but I took away from the conversation that she was interested. And as a writer, that's the key to any story. I don't write for myself. I write for an audience. I don't even write for sales so much. I just want someone to read it. If we wrote for ourselves or our families, we'd either share it with our families or we'd stick it in a drawer and say, done. We write for an audience. This is a universal story, the story of any family in the 1940s. I'm any son that inherits the stories. You are the children of stories yourself. Every family has a story. So I'm now looking at this story, and I'm seeing not just one family, but a family that's part of a larger story, a story that involves a hospital that is vital to a community, that treated thousands of people. And if Eloise wanted to keep all of its people away from society, it wouldn't have turned over its population by 1/3 every year. The psychiatric population of Eloise, which grew to a total of 5,000, sent 1/3 of those patients back into the community long before there was medication that allowed to treat them at home. My aunt was part of the 2/3. My aunt was part of the long-term population, in her case, the custodial population, the population that was never going home. Now we know that many families did not do what my family did. They cared for their severely ill at home, either disabled physically, in my aunt's case, also with a mental illness. Now, somebody asked me last night, what was your aunt's diagnosis? There was no diagnosis when she went to Eloise. That's kind of hard to imagine. But that same state law that I told you about before didn't require a diagnosis. It required 2 physicians to examine the patient and to declare him or her, quote, actually insane. There was a form letter that they filled out in which there was space left to describe what they were seeing. But it was 1 page, very compact, I was able to obtain those examinations in the court records of Wayne County. The other piece of paper that's important is the petition that my grandmother signed asking the state of Michigan to take care of her ill child. I also have that document. The first word in that place where the description of the illness is allowed is the word patient. Did you think my grandmother wrote those words? Would you describe your child as patient? That's not the relationship you have with your child. It would be daughter, my son, my child. So my grandmother was part of this larger system that I described. To use another metaphor, when that locomotive was leaving the station, it was going to Eloise and nobody could get off of it. My grandmother had given over her child because her child needed help. She was described as being paranoid, as not wanting to bathe, not wanting to eat, as talking about people wanting to see her in her coffin, which probably had some truth to it in a way, if you're part of a disabled population and you feel isolated. Going outside, she'd stand on the curb for 30 minutes, refused to cross the street. That was my grandmother's words to the social worker. So this is a person who is in need of help, but probably doesn't need to be in an institution for 31 years. I don't say that for dramatic effect. I say it because today, there's no way that Annie would be in an institution. She was bright enough to hold a job. She could probably live independently on her own in a group home. Would be the opportunities or options available to somebody in Annie's situation. But she did need treatment, and it would be wrong of me to suggest that she was in Eloise for, quote, no reason. But she was in an institution for 31 years for no reason. But that was the system that we had at the time, and my grandparents, who were poor immigrants from Russia, as you remember, they didn't have a way to, let's say, fight the system because they were asking the system for help. They didn't have a way to react to the system. My mother was probably the interpreter, although it was not my mother who decided that Annie should go to the institution. What was the larger system that Eloise fit into? Every state had mental hospitals of the size of Eloise. The great asylums, there were larger ones that were psychiatric alone. There were not too many that were larger than Eloise. Eloise, in its heyday, had 10,000 residents, 5,000 psychiatric, 5,000 infirm or homeless. When they built the new barracks in 1932 to house the homeless from the Depression, it was filled in an afternoon. There was more people who needed to go there than they had space for. Some of those people never left. Some of those people left every summer. It was kind of like the hotel you can check into. Every state had these hospitals, and every state, therefore, even though it's a national system, it's governed by state laws, and every state's laws are different. Michigan's state laws existed until 1974, when a federal judge panel ruled that the entire system was unconstitutional, largely for due process reasons. You went there and you didn't have many rights. And the entire code was rewritten in 1974. It went from a system where patients couldn't attend their own hearings for the most part, or didn't. I mean, they could, but they didn't, because the hospitals would not let them go, to a system in which patients have not only very many rights, but paramount rights. So if you're a patient today and you refuse treatment, unless you're a danger to yourself or others, you're going to be left alone. I think I favor that system than the system we used to have. But it's a system that still causes problems. We all know that there are people who are living without a home who have as part of their background a mental health issue. We know that there are people today who are not at Eloise, but instead they're in a jail somewhere in a segregated floor where it's been determined they have a mental health issue and they're segregated from the population. If I were trying to redesign mental health services, and there are many, many good mental health services, it doesn't need to be totally redesigned, we are doing better than we did before, I would say that one of the first orders of business is not to isolate people from populations and the rest of society. Isolation is itself a label. Isolation is what Eloise was, because as we all had our parents, my parents actually didn't do this because I lived too far away, but drive by Eloise and say, if you don't behave, I'm going to put you in there. What you're saying is, I'm going to put you away. And Eloise was a place to go away for a while or for a long time. In 1955, we had the largest number of people in the country who were being treated inpatient in a hospital or in a facility. Does anybody know the number? 550,000 people were living as a resident of a psychiatric facility. That was the peak because that was the year that medication was introduced that allowed you to be treated at home. And so the beds that had been overcrowded began to become empty over a gradual period of time. Then we had a sort of philosophical and legal revolution in the 60s as we even discussed the question of what is mental illness? Is there any such thing as mental illness? And the idea of a spectrum of behavior came into existence. So that's what led to lawsuits like the one against Eloise. That federal judge panel I talked about was hearing a case involving a patient at Eloise. And those kinds of lawsuits were being filed all over the country by advocates for people with a mental illness. Today, how many people do you think we have in being treated in psychiatric facilities? Well, the country's population has doubled. So if we do the simple math, we should have about 1 million people. We have fewer than 40,000. So we were right then and wrong now. Should we have 1 million people? Were we wrong then and we're right now? Or should we have some people who are homeless being treated in a psychiatric facility with all of the rights that they should have and the reviews that they should have to make sure that they're not being kept there against their will? I don't know the answer to that. But what I do know is that every generation will confront these issues because as we continue to learn more and more about the progress of mental health treatment, we're going to reassess what we do. And I'm sure this library will exist 50 years from now. And I'm sure there will be some meeting in this room at some point, and they'll be asking themselves, what were they thinking in 2014 when they did ... So if we look back at the past and we think to ourselves, oh, we're so much better than things were back then. Even as we accept the truth of that, we shouldn't be smug about it because people will be looking at us and making judgments about what we've done. So with that, I think my 20 minutes may have been more like 30. I'll stop and I'll take questions, comments, suggestions, bathroom breaks. Remember, there's books out there, I believe. Andy, are they for sale? Andy, are there books for sale afterwards? Somebody asked me that. And yes, I will sign books until you guys are tired of seeing me. They want you to come to the microphone because everything is being videoed for the internet and for posterity. So if you're shy and you don't want to be on television, does anybody not want to be on television? But if you're shy, remember that you shouldn't ask your question at the microphone. You should ask me afterwards.
Yes. Was Annie's leg, I'm trying to get a better image of her. Was Annie's leg amputated just above the knee or at the hip?
No, just above the knee.
Just above the knee.
Yeah.
So that was the size of the leg.
But it was above the knee. It wasn't below the knee. Yeah.
It get fastened above the knee.
Yes.
You have to learn to walk on it.
Yes, she
But
did.
a lot of people don't. They end up with an amputation and they spend the rest of their lives in a wheelchair. Some people do.
Yes.
I just want to know what I think.
There's a wonderful moment we had at a talk in Traverse City when someone in a wheelchair who has cerebral palsy, a young person in a writing class, asked me, when you look at me, do you see my aunt? Do you see your aunt? It's an incredibly brave question for an 18-year-old to ask. And I said to her, quite frankly, no, my aunt wasn't in a wheelchair and she didn't have a speech impediment. But I want to ask you a question. Do you think that all people who do not have disabilities that are visible look at you and think that you're all alike? All disabilities are the same? And she said, yes, I do. Which is an incredible answer to think about. We differentiate people by hair color and size and gender. We ought to look at people with disabilities and remember they are individuals with an individual issue, not a group issue.
Good morning. In doing your research, would any of those people that were in LOEs or other mental health institutions today be determined to have been some type of dementia or Alzheimer's?
Yes. Yes, I think so. Although today, you know, the main diagnosis for people who are included in the category of having a mental health issue is substance abuse. That is considered to be a mental health issue. And I was once giving a talk at a substance abuse agency. And I said to them, how many people do you see who have a mental health issue also have a substance abuse issue? They said, 100%. Now, that was the population they treated, but what they were trying to say was it's a very large group of people.
Thank you.
Well, I really don't have a question. I kind of have a statement. I was in Eloise for a few days back in the early 1970s. And at the time, there were 3 other ladies with me who were as same as I am this moment. And they had been committed to Eloise by their husbands for disobedience. Oh, it was really, you could in those days. That, you know, if you didn't behave yourself, you know, think about it. 1950s was Barbie doll age, you know, and we all had to comply and do the rules and all that kind of stuff. 1970s, there were still people being forced because they didn't obey their husband.
Well, thank you for that comment. If someone can lend me a book, I'll read you something.
She has one.
Her comment was, I don't know if there's something wrong with the microphone. Her comment was that she was at Eloise for several days, and she met 3 other women, and they said that their reason for being there is because their husbands had decided they were disobedient, and that was what caused. I don't know when they entered the hospital, but to amplify that, I'll read you something. This is what the state law. This is what the state law in effect in 1940 said. If somebody came and signed a petition saying that I was in need of being treated at a mental hospital because I was, quote, actually insane, who can file such a petition? The father, mother, husband, wife, brother, sister, child, guardian could petition the court, or the sheriff, superintendent of the poor, a county agent, or anyone that a judge deemed to be a proper person could make such a petition. Well, isn't that kind of the universe? Whose book is this? Go ahead.
First, Steve, I want to thank you very much personally because my uncle spent a considerable amount of years of his life in Eloise. And you brought so much insight into his life in some way, as well as the history of Eloise. In so many ways, it informed me. Now, I'm going to ask you, after you have written this book, how has that book informed you?
Well, it didn't change my life, because that's a little too dramatic, but it gave me so many different opportunities. First of all, meeting the people throughout the state and doing the Great Michigan Read, I've heard so many stories, learned so much about the lives of people with a disability, changed my view of how to speak with with people who have a disability. It also changed, in a wonderful way, my view of my mom. Now, people have said to me, you should be angry at your mom, but I'm not angry at my mom. It's just not who I am. I got to spend time with my mom at an age when most of us never meet our parents. My mom is more vividly 20 years old to me than she was 82. I sat there with the letters that she wrote to my father, the letters my father wrote to her. I never would have read those letters had I not written this book. I knew they existed, but as my sister had warned me, they reek of cigarette smoke and they're moldy. You're going to get sick reading them, and I poo-pooed her, and then after a week I was sick. But it was a delight to meet her at an age, I don't know about you guys, but I still think I'm 20. You know, you walk down the street, you don't have children, you don't have a spouse, you're just looking at the world. Well, you know, so I got to meet her in that period, and it wasn't that I needed to replace the image of her at 82. I lived with both of those images. As Einstein once said, you know, human beings are more complicated than the rest of, it's a paraphrase, than the rest of the world because they can hold two thoughts in their head at the same time. I can share that view of my mom as the secret keeper, but I can also share her as the kind, loving, generous mom that she really was. And now I have this third image of her as a young person. We pay no attention to our parents as young people. You know, we get to about 10 years old and we think, oh my gosh, you were alive before you had me? So that was one of the things that was a great benefit from it. You know, I also learned that I can write books, which I'm now doing a second one. I'm not going to talk about it. We're all superstitious, us writers, but you know, so those three things are, I think, are three major takeaways from what happened to me in writing the book. Thank you for asking me.
I have a little more personal question that ties in with your immediate previous response. I got the impression from reading the book that you had a very good relationship with your mother and that you did respect her and you did think highly of her. How do you reconcile revealing that her secret that she didn't want anyone to know and you've revealed it to everyone? How do you reconcile that personally?
Excellent question. Excellent question. The answer is that if my mom were still alive, this would be her story, hers to tell. I guess when I believe that when someone dies, they don't get to control everything about the life that they live. Unless, I suppose if my mom had written me a letter saying, I'm now going to tell you this secret that I didn't tell you while I was alive, and I under no circumstances want you, the investigative reporter, to start investigating me. I probably would have honored that. Because I didn't go rushing off to write this story after she died, and that letter from the cemetery came. It only was because of that fortunate experience of having the agent. I do think that, you know, I'm not given to quoting German philosophers very often, but Hegel once said that the great tragedies in the world are the conflicts between two rights, not between right and wrong. I have a right, I think, to tell this story. We have a right to know our family history. I wouldn't call it necessarily a right, that's a little bit dramatic. But I would say that what I really weighed was, are people going to benefit from this secret that was a destructive thing in its lifetime? That secret was destructive for my mom. It was a burden to my mom. She would have been a much happier person had she released it. So many people have told me how this book has affected them that I believe my mom would be proud of her son for writing it, even as she probably would have told me, Stephen, I don't want you to write this. There's no right answer in this case, but that's how I reconciled it to myself, is that I thought there was some benefit from writing it, and I thought that it can't do my mom any harm. The secret, as I write in the very last sentence, is now free. Free to go into memory. Free to become part of the many stories that we have. We all have stories, and that's what the Humanities Council is trying to do, is to let us tell the stories of our lives.
Thank you.
I recall from reading the book that your siblings had different reactions to your undertaking this project. And I'm wondering if, in the years since, there's been any evolution of each of their reactions.
Well, I wish they were all here to answer the question themselves so that you don't get it filtered through me. I have a self-interest in how they feel. Everybody hear the question, which is how my siblings have reacted since the book had come out, since there were different reactions while I was doing the book, and how those feelings have evolved. I was talking to my brother Michael the other night. My brother Michael, who's older than I am by 7 years, was the most skeptical. Not, I think, for the obvious dirty linen airing problem, but because he didn't really know how I was going to get to the truth of my mom's motivation, since I could no longer interview her. And I had to do that by substituting my mom's friends and trying to find other other people who might know what she felt. I teased him, though, because I said, 12 books come out about Lincoln every year. Nobody's going to interview Lincoln. It's not the only way to write history, is what I'm trying to say. But to answer the question, my younger brother, Jeff, and my older sister, Marcia, were both really interested in learning more about the story. Michael was skeptical, but he was not putting any roadblocks in my way. And I think had he done so early on, I actually said that to my brother-in-law at one point, if I felt that Michael was really upset about this, I probably wouldn't have the courage to go on. And his reaction was, why would you let him have a veto over your art? And the answer is, I don't know, but I might. In fact, Michael is not. He's not perturbed by the book. When writers ask me about any tips I might have for writing about your own family, I'd say if you want everything to be nice and sweet and nothing go wrong, don't start. But if you're going to start, remember that they have feelings too, and to include them in the process that you're involved in, because they don't know what you're doing, and most of us fear the unknown. That's really what our great fear is. And so I allowed them to read the manuscript before it went to New York. Now, it does help that I'm not really writing about them, although they own the story a little bit too. Since then, just the other night, Michael and I were talking, and he had asked me for the first time about the Great Michigan Read, which has given me a whole lot of new stories to tell him about how people are reacting to the book. And I don't know for certain, because I didn't ask him it in the end, but he sounded awfully surprised, one, at the number of people who come out to talks like this, two, the way they relate to it. And I think it gave him a better perspective about why I might have had some validity in my view that this was an important book to write. At least that's my self-interest. But thank you for asking that. We have more questions? We must have more questions.
I'd just like to share a little, because
You do have a wonderful voice. You might have been a teacher or something.
I'm a teacher.
Could I get, my wife is a former librarian and teacher, so I know that voice.
Number one, you must have incredible blessings from your research and all that you pursued. And in reading your book, I was like, years, right? It was great. A couple other things. The whole thing about your mom and how you discovered who she was as a girl. And one of the most wonderful things I see in our society today is funerals of elderly people. And my mother said, now don't you do any of those pictures. I don't want any of that stuff. Mm-hmm. But we did. And the posters of her, childhood, womanhood, mother, but mother of toddlers, that it gives to me sometimes this whole perspective of a person's life that you don't really know, even your own parents, right? But, and all you've done for people who were exposed or influenced or involved with Eloise or people in their families with these kinds of troubles, and we all have them. Yeah, I think you said that to us. And I just think, bless you.
Well, thank you.
You've done a great job.
And that's why, one of the saddest things, of course, that we confront as families is when a young person dies, because they don't have that whole life that you just described. But if someone has had a good full life, and we can show that full life, I mean, funerals, if funerals were for the living as much as for the dead, we'd all be better off. Because we're here to honor and respect that life that came before us. And so that's the way, when I go to a funeral, I think about it that way. I think about how there's a chance for these people to get together. And yes, we're mourning, and yes, we're in grief, but we're also getting to know each other through this person. Anybody who's in the overflow room, by the way, if you want to come and ask a question, please come. We'd be glad to have you. There might even be a seat for you.
I'm not sure.
impressive. My grandmother was in Eloise. 10 or 15 years.
You might want to get closer to the mic. People want to hear you.
We know almost nothing who passed. I mean, it wasn't a secret. We just don't know. Now I have a 50-year-old stepson. Well, she was diagnosed schizophrenic, paranoid schizophrenic. I have a 50-year-old son, same diagnosis. And we went out to California next week to bring him home because he still needs help. So we're caught in the middle of your story. So it's going to be interesting. But one of the things that brought to my mind is the older I get, as I get older, you think of all the questions you wish you had answered. And the older I get, the more questions there are, and the more frustrating. Mom's gone, I can't ask. Why, when, how, who? So when I talk to the kids, my message is ask the questions now. So you don't go crazy.
And do you know any kids who will actually listen to that advice?
Anyway, because 40 years down the road, you never know what's going to come up.
Well, and it's difficult because not everybody is a storyteller either. So you could ask an older person the questions, and maybe they're not so forthcoming. Maybe it's not even about secrecy; they just don't feel comfortable. But yes, ask the questions. I was talking to a young woman last night, and she was putting pressure on herself to go down and talk to her grandfather, who's in his 80s, to tell his story, and she wanted to write something about this. And she said, I'm going to do it all in a week. And I said, don't put that pressure on yourself. Go down and spend several days with him and record him so that you have it, but don't make yourself have to write it all in a week's time. And especially if your grandfather's not asking you to write it, and that's self-imposed pressure. So.
I'm in family genealogy, and I find that there is no beginning, there is no end. But I have, because of that genealogy, I thank you for the work, because you've already done half the work. Half the work is just finding where to go look. Then you go look. Thank you.
Well, the great thing about the genealogy community is that it's full of people who are smarter, better, and more professional than I am, and who, at every library almost, I assume in the Westland Library, that there is a genealogy chapter or group, and they love to give people help. I know because they gave me help. I'm not a genealogist. I'm a storyteller who took advantage of genealogists to find out things. But I'm not a family tree person, but I certainly am a storyteller person.
I know you're writing another book now, but I was wondering if you had any thoughts of continuing on with Annie's story. You said you had run into a lot of people now, or heard from more people who knew your family, and we've gotten to be family with you, and we were wondering if you were going to go on and give us some information, even on a website or something like that.
Well, that's an excellent idea. I could use my website to, the stories that I've been able to collect since the book has come out don't change the essence of the story, thank God. One thing gave me a real fright, I'll tell you. A genealogist wrote me and said, you didn't mention when your grandparents died what their obituaries said in terms of survivors. Now, you people who have read the book, could I have been any more exhausting in my research? Never occurred to me. Never occurred to me to do the basic genealogical technique of looking for my grandparents' obituaries. Why? Well, I don't know why, but I think because I thought they probably didn't have any. Because they weren't, ordinary people, they didn't really read the free press or the news, et cetera. But I scrambled to the internet, where fortunately the Jewish news is online, and I could look up obituaries by name, and my heart went into my throat when I realized that they both had obituaries. And I pulled the obituaries up, and I'm sorry to tell you this, but when it said survived by one daughter, I said, yes! So I could go online and tell more stories. I'll tell you one story that some of you told me before when I was meeting you in the line as you were waiting to come in that you had lived at Eloise. This young woman was 12 years old, she said, when she met Annie, sometime probably in the 1950s. she came to a talk that I gave, and she said to me privately, I met your aunt in the soda fountain where the residents and the residents of the hospital, but also the residents of the, the sons and daughters of the employees would mingle. And I was very touched that she told me the story, but I was skeptical that she had actually met the Annie, because there are a lot of Annies in the world. And so I said, well, why do you think it would, what made you think it was my aunt? Because you've read the book, and maybe the book influenced you, hoping that you could tell me the story. And she said, well, I called my sisters. We were all teenagers. We all went to this Catholic school nearby, and we'd come back and go to the soda fountain. It was just this one summer. For some reason, Annie was there a lot during that one summer in the soda fountain. And she said to her sister, I'm reading this book. You remember that woman who we met in the soda fountain? And she said, you mean the one with the wooden leg? I said, okay, you win. But it was really wonderful what she said to me. At the end, she said, I came tonight because I wanted you to know that Annie, from my perspective as a 12-year-old, was happy. She was smiling and bubbly and engaging with us. We got to know her. And of course, she can't know Annie's life, neither can I. And it's nice to know that Annie was happy in those moments, and I don't know that she was happy as a general rule. But I thought it was wonderful that woman felt so strongly about that she wanted me to know that little bit of the story that she knew. And that would be a good thing to tell, I think, on my website.
Do you think you'll ever find a picture?
No, I don't think I will. I mean, I think with the publication of the book and wonderful events like this, I think if it had a picture of it out there, I probably would have come my way. I did try very hard to find a photograph. I know that one was taken of all patients who were admitted to Eloise. And so there should be one in the files. And if you all would like to join me in storming the barricades at the Wayne County where the Eloise records are, maybe they say they can't find any, but maybe they're there. Photographs just weren't taken routinely in those days in the candid way that we take of them now. Now probably, Annie herself would have a cell phone. She'd do a selfie for us.
I was curious what your father was like as you were growing up, and your surprise, I guess, when you read about his history and then the military records and such.
Well, my father is the great unknown in this story. I don't like to talk about him too much because I like to leave the people who haven't read the book something to go after. But of course, when I started writing the book, the main question I had was Dad aware of Annie? And I read these 600 letters, and there was no mention of Annie in those letters. And I thought it was impossible that he not know. I mean, he was married to my mom. They were married for 35 years, and they had, I think, a very close relationship. Not always a perfect relationship, but a close one. But today, I'm not sure, and I've leaned, as you know, toward the end of the book in thinking that he did not. I didn't set out to research my dad's background, but I did want to understand, and after I read those letters, I did want to understand where he was coming from. And when I discovered that he too had the treatment for a mental health issue while he was in the Army, it seemed to be not only relevant to the story, but explained a lot to me about him when I was growing up. My dad and I had a decent relationship, but as you know from reading the book, there's that scene where he comes to me, I'm about 14 years old, and he says, let's go to the ball game. And my thought is, let's go to the ball game? When have you ever asked me to go to the ball game? You're always working. He didn't have a chance he wasn't off during ball game hours. But we grew closer as I was an adult. I think he felt more comfortable talking to me when I was 25 than when I was 15. When I was 15, he would ask questions, like I'd come home at night and he'd be upset for something at work, I assume, and he would say to me with a great amount of anger, why haven't you taken out the garbage? And being a smart-ass 15-year-old, I would say, you don't want to know why I didn't take the garbage out. You just want me to take the garbage out. Ask me to take the garbage out. Now, how would you like to be the parent of that child? But as he reveals to me when I'm about 25 25 that he isn't a citizen of the country. His roundabout way of doing that, of course, was to use the old trick of, I have this friend, ... It took me about a minute and a half before I said, Dad, this friend doesn't exist, this is you. But, of course, even as he's revealing that, I'm thinking about how he's revealing that to me. He's trusting me with this information that he was not willing to trust me before. I'm not upset with him. I mean, my first reaction was to hunt through my mind about what it means to be a citizen. And it's like back in 8th grade, and I'm thinking, but wait a minute, you told me you voted for Nixon. And he said, you didn't listen. I said, I didn't vote for Nixon, and I never would, and I can't. But that's my reaction, you know. When someone tells you something like that, you say something silly like, wait a minute, you didn't vote?
Thank you for all this insight that you've given. I've got a similar story, but too long to go into. But I'd like to know, in your research, you said that you talked to some of your mom's friends and associates just to get a perspective of her. Do you still keep in contact with these people? Do you consider them part of your family?
Well, yes and no. I mean, the friends my mom had when she was 20 years old have all passed away. Most of them had already passed away by the time I started researching the book, but Julie Reisner, who you meet at the end of the book, died about 3 years ago. I have spoken occasionally to my mom's former boss, who has just a very short cameo appearance in the book. The cousin I never met until, she says I met her when I was about 2 years old, but that I met when I was starting to do the book in 2006, Anna Olowek. She died about 18 months ago. And I did keep up with her a little bit for a while. She got quite sick, and she wasn't really receiving visitors, so it was hard to keep up with her. Her son, though, her son David, who makes an appearance in the book when I'm interviewing Anna, I saw him last night at an event, and I've seen him many times since the book has come out. His sister I've seen a little bit. So these are new people, in my life. Anybody else? I'm not sure. There's a young woman who was my mom's, the daughter of my mom's bridge partner. I've heard about her recently, but we weren't really friends before, so we're really not friends now. I love the bridge scene, by the way. These 4 women playing this game of deception, all holding this secret but not talking to each other about it, but all knowing it. I think that's a wonderful little moment. All sitting in the cone, what I call the cone of silence.
Have you ever heard the term, what happens on this side of the river stays on this side of the river?
Only in the Las Vegas context.
My grandparents' family were out in Canada. And their fourth child, my uncle, had Down syndrome. And I had a cousin who was 81, came to my grandfather's funeral, lived to 102, and found out that he had a cousin. Nobody knew. My grandmother never took him to Canada. His mother knew, but absolutely nobody else, and it was just a big secret. And my grandmother would not give him up. He was born in the 30s. And all the doctors, the priests, everybody said, you've got to put him up here. And she wouldn't do it. And she had him as a change of life baby. She had some health issues later, and he became very strong. And one time she was giving him a bath, and she went to get a towel, and he ran in the nude all the way up 2 blocks to get his candy at the candy store. So they finally had to have him put him up here. And this was back in the late 30s. There were no expressways. Every Sunday that was drivable, they had to drive from Rosedale Gardens and go all the way over to here. And one time they went, he came up, hugged my grandfather, he hugged him. She never forgave him. She said, you don't even know your own son. She said, you don't know, because he said a lot of them looked alike. But secrets, I mean, our family was really great at secrets. And to not even know that you have a cousin, and nobody knew about him. So there were some secrets on the Canadian side, too, I found out.
and those didn't cross the river either. But that was
I like that term.
Yeah, but that was on this side of the river, stays on the side of the river. I mean, I get that in my head all the time. I'm trying to remember not to tell anybody anything. But back then, I mean, they had to finally move. They were in the city, they moved out to Rosedale Gardens. It must have been horrible for the three siblings because nobody ever saw Down syndrome. So as the years went on, I worked at a school of nursing and discovered oh, and by the way, I didn't know about him until I was about 12 years old, and I lived with my grandparents, and I was looking for Christmas presents. And I came across a little white book. It was something like The Littlest Angel or something, written by Dale Evans. And they had a Down syndrome child. So when I read that when I was around 12, I thought, I'll bet you, because they always called them Little Harry, and they were very fond of them, but there wasn't one single picture of him, which I thought was strange. Come to find out, when he died, my grandfather destroyed every picture of him. So my grandmother never forgave for that. Well, my mother's sister died recently, and they found this little teeny picture, and it said Little Harry on the back, and my grandfather showing him how to hit a ball. It's the only picture remaining.
Wow.
I mean, it was just, it broke her heart.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, so talk about secrets in the family.
Well, you know, you mentioned so many things in your little storytelling there. And the issue of destroying photographs, why? Well, obviously shame had something to do with it, or keeping the secret. And I haven't talked very much about shame in my conversation, in part because I think shame is where the story begins, but it's certainly not the whole story. My mother, if she were ashamed, would have created a secret long before she did, but she didn't really create that secret because it was impossible. They were living in the neighborhood together. But the other side of shame, of course, is stigma. And stigma is still with us, reduced, I hope, I'm sure, but still with us. And stigmas change all the time. I mean, in the 1980s, when AIDS became a disease that we suddenly had to confront, there was shame and stigma around AIDS. Well, that had never been with us in the 1940s, so it tells me that every generation creates its own taboos. And that's why shame and stigma are very hard to get rid of entirely. One way to get rid of the stigma around mental illness would be to open the records of the mental health patients from 50 to 100 years ago and let families see them. Why do we keep those records confidential? I mean, I suppose in the spirit of the question that was asked before, I know that the questioner wasn't suggesting that my mother had total control of the story. I suppose you could say, well, those people haven't allowed us to look at their records. Well, we can change that. We can ask people who are alive today whether they would like their records to be closed 50, 70 years, but no one should be allowed to close records forever because they are a benefit to other people. And if you have a generation-skipping disease in your family, and there are many generation-skipping diseases, you should know about that. It shouldn't be a secret to you. So I don't know why we keep those records closed other than to say, in a metaphoric way, you should not want to see those things. Well, why not? If we're accepting of a mental health problem, those records should not be scary to us. Andy, you have any, we're 11:20 now, I don't want to go on forever, but don't want to exclude anybody either.
Can everyone hear me? I'm kind of short. Okay. I need you to clarify something that you said in your lecture. You said at Eloise there was no clear diagnosis of what the mental health issue or issues
That's actually,
were.
to me, I should clarify
Okay.
because I didn't say that.
You did not say that?
But I said there was no diagnosis required in the commission papers.
Okay, refresh
That's what I
my
meant. In other words,
memory then.
when Annie was admitted to Eloise, if you read the record of her admission, there's no diagnosis required at that moment.
Okay. Okay.
Naturally, the staff at Eloise would have diagnosed her. But I don't have those records, so I don't know in 1940 what her diagnosis was. I do know that when she died in 1972, on her death certificate, they listed undifferentiated chronic schizophrenia as part of the reason for her death. Now, when that diagnosis was attached to her case, I don't know. I just know it's there in 1972. So I'm sorry I misled you.
Oh, that's okay. You've clarified that now.
Okay.
She saw some other doctors over a period of time. Didn't some of these doctors come up with some kind of diagnosis?
It's a very good question. The records that I looked at were created around the time of her admission and afterwards. The social worker who created what was called the routine history of the case spoke to a social worker who had previously seen Annie from the period of about 1937 to 1940 and summarized what she said, but it was more of a description of what she was seeing. For example, she described that Annie had said that she was the victim of a sexual assault on the way home from one of her clinic appointments where she was alone. There's no police record of such an assault. I don't think any report was made, which doesn't mean the assault didn't occur, but the assault wasn't described in any detail. I don't know that anybody ever diagnosed her as having a mental health problem, which really didn't begin to manifest itself until about 1938. Most of the early history of Annie and her medical history was about her leg.
Okay, could it have been that her mental health issues were overlooked because of her physical infirmity?
I absolutely think that they were overlooked.
Okay.
I think that today, because we know so much more about the psychological consequences of certain kinds of physical ailments, she would have received counseling much earlier, certainly would have received counseling around the amputation. I don't think that psychology had progressed to the point where we thought that was necessary. Then there's also the issue of poverty. If my grandparents had had means, perhaps they would have been much more able to be aggressive about taking Annie to more and more people. I know that she saw somebody at Harper Hospital, and that somebody, whose name I can't now quite recall, he was the one who suggested that she might benefit from being sent to Lapeer, because she was, her IQ test showed that she was at about 80 and perhaps was developmentally disabled. But Lapeer was full, and she had these mental health symptoms, and so it was decided that Eloise was available and she should go there instead. Probably was better for her to go to Eloise perhaps than Lapeer.
You do say in the book some things about your grandmother's resentment toward the system for not meeting their needs, and did you also say that she attributed it to the fact that they were impoverished?
Well, I didn't say it quite that specifically because she didn't say it quite that specifically. I mean, there was an interesting discussion last night at this one event because of the changing language that people use throughout history, and the social worker described my grandmother as a whiny Jewish woman, and I liked that. Not because I liked the description, but because I really wanted to get a sense of how she perceived my grandmother, and that was very vivid to me. I didn't get a sense that she was saying that because of the way that she was appearing that she wasn't going to give her help, only that she was not a very happy person and she resented the system. And I mean, I think it would be inevitable. You're kind of in desperate straits. You want help for your child who is, as my grandmother said to the social worker, everyone is going crazy because of Annie. So you go to the hospital and you get advice, and you're kind of caught. I mean, what are you going to do? Say, I'm going to take her home and I'm not going to pay any attention to you? We don't have any means by which to get private care. Can't go to a private hospital. So she was kind of stuck with the system as it was. That can cause resentment even as you're taking advantage of it. Remember Einstein, hold two thoughts in your head at the same time. Okay. Thank you for those very good questions. And here is the final question.
First of all, I want to thank you for writing the book, letting other families know that they're not the only one that has to deal with bipolar schizophrenia. My sister, as I was growing up, and my mother and dad, when you say ashamed, I think they were, because it was never a topic of conversation when they came home from the hospital. It was their way of dealing with it. If they didn't talk about it, it wasn't happening. And I had to deal with my sister after my parents died, and it wasn't fun. And I wish I had taken notes because I could have written a book. It's not something I ever talked about. My friends never knew about. It just didn't happen. But thank you.
Well, that's a very interesting and perceptive comment because, your parents may have been in some sort of a denial as well as a shame, but maybe not. I mean, we do the things that we need to do to survive.
Exactly.
And there's a huge difference between privacy and secrecy. If everybody knew that your family, your sister had some difficulties, that's not a secret. That's just something your parents weren't talking about.
Oh, no.
On the other hand, perhaps, you would have wished they talked about it more, at least with you, and families, as a result of the closing of places like Eloise, much more of a responsibility was put onto families. And, my mother wasn't you. I mean, she did not take care of Annie because Eloise was taking care of Annie after my grandparents passed away. But there are many people who are in your situation, and that's why organizations like the National Alliance on Mental Illness came into existence, because it was recognized in 1979 when that organization began that families needed help just as patients needed help. And so it's not really a patient advocacy organization, although it does some of that. It's a family support organization.
Right.
And I think it's become a very critical part of the mental health system. I think if you talk to most mental health professionals, they'll tell you that they work with NAMI. They're not in opposition to NAMI, which is that National Alliance on Mental Illness. So thank you for sharing that. That's a very appropriate note on which to end. Thank you for coming. Thank you for all the programs.
We'd also like to thank you all for coming, and to let you know that Steve will be signing copies of his book. If you brought a copy, he'll be signing those, and we also have copies for sale here for $15. So once again, thank you all for coming. Once again, thank you, Steve, for this wonderful and engaging talk.
Well, thanks to the library, because not only do you serve as community centers by having talks like this, but without libraries, not only would writers have no place to research, but their books would have no place to live. So thank you very much.